Thinking positive thoughts is not enough to fuel your well-being. That's because you are an emotional being at your core. Hi, I'm Josephine Tite, founder of Positivity Center and a well-being consultant. Join me in conversation with friends who are willing to be vulnerable and share how they lean into their emotional center. Stop pouring from an empty cup, my friends, and instead lean in and learn to trust your heart. Welcome to Wellbeing That Works version 2.0, a heart-based approach. Okay, well, hello and welcome to the show today. Benvenuti. I wish I could be talking to this whole show in Italian because my guest is Italian. So excited. But from across the oceans, not in Italy today, but in the Netherlands, I'd like to introduce you to Paola. Hello and welcome. Can you introduce yourself to the guests?
Thank you, Josephine, for inviting me to your show. Ciao, everyone. I'm Italian, as she introduced me. I've been living in the Netherlands since almost 5 years, and I call myself a workplace well-being expert because that's my work, my mission, and my passion. So I work with companies as regard with well-being, with whatever helps them bring well-being to their employees. It can be movement, it can be well-being talks, it can be also strategy for them to develop over like the short or long term, depending on their needs, around well-being. And it's a very like 360 interpretation of well-being.
Yeah, I love that. Yeah, we really do spend some time in similar fields, and I'm all about enhancing the well-being of organizations, but doing that through enhancing the well-being of their people. Because you know that any great organization is only great because it's got great people. So it's really important that we take care of those people. And COVID's been tough because it has shifted priorities in organizations, and some organizations more than others have not been able to really nurture, right, the relationships and the well-being of their people. So, well, how do you, when you're talking to organizations, how do you define well-being? Like, what does it mean to you and how do you express it to them?
So for me, well-being, as I mentioned before, is a very holistic. So I come from a movement practice. So I'm also a yoga teacher. So for me, for example, movement is very important. So physical well-being is a big part of it, but it doesn't stop there. So for me, when I talk about well-being, it's also, for example, mental. And through what I've been studying and experiencing of myself, mind and body are very much connected. So one doesn't exist without the other. And there is a strong connection between the two in a way that the mind influences the body, but also the other way around. Like the body also influences, mind influences body and body influences the mind.
Yeah.
So that is a big piece. And I think that, as you mentioned, COVID has been a really eye-opener for a lot of people, especially as it comes to mental health. And for that, I'm kind of like, in a certain way, grateful, because we got to understand also what our priorities are. And for a lot of people, it turns out of like choosing not to stay in a workplace that were not suiting themselves any longer. So a lot of people were like suffering before COVID, and the situation got even worse because they were isolated. They didn't have their like regular tools to like decompress, self-regulate. And I think they really understand that workplace is an important piece of the puzzle. We spend so much time at work, and we want that place to be healthy. We want that place to be supporting our well-being. Because as you mentioned, workplaces are made of people. And if people are not feeling well, they cannot be productive, they cannot be their best self and come out with the best ideas. They cannot be resilient, they cannot be creative. And I think that especially nowadays, we live in such a complex and ever-evolving and ever-changing world, that those are the skills that we want to have. Those are like the soft skills. I was reading an article today that was talking about how important it is to develop those skills in the current workplace, into the current labor market as well.
Yeah.
So I think that it comes to physical for sure, mental, emotional plays a big role. But for me, it's also about connection. So I love the piece about community. So being part of something bigger, being part of a group, being part of a community. And also for me, well-being is time in nature. So I love nature. For me, nature is really healing, is really grounding. And especially because I live in a city, I notice a difference in how I feel when I can have the chance to go to nature. I'm leaving for Costa Rica on Thursday, and I know Costa Rica is just nature. So I'm just like so happy to be spending 3 weeks there, just like offline, completely digital detox, and just being immersed in nature. But it's also sometimes just walking in the park. So I live in Amsterdam, and I have Wonder Park really close by. So for me, taking that moment for myself to just like walk at the park, maybe listening to something and just like unwind, that's part of my well-being.
Yeah. I remember reading ages ago that even in cities, you know, it's important when you can't get out of the city to find nature in the city. And another one of the things was to look up, because if you look up, and even if you're in the middle of buildings and you look up, you can see the sun, the clouds, the sky, a bird,
Exactly.
you know? Yeah.
Exactly. That's why sometimes when I teach events with companies, and like, if you're stuck in a building and maybe you don't have the chance ideally to take a walk, like like lunch break, just look outside. Also just like looking not in a screen, but like shifting your gaze to something that is like farther than like one arm, like screen distance, is also so much beneficial for your mind, for your eyes, for your whole like also focus. And I was reading a research really interesting, is that the benefits starts to be there also if you look at a picture of nature on the screen. And I was like, oh wow, that's like next level. So of course it's ideal if you can spend like time in nature.
Yeah.
But if you don't have that, and if you're in need of like that calming effect of nature, just look at a picture of a forest or like beach or like seaside.
Yeah. You know, even, you know, I don't know if you on your TVs have a channel that shows a fireplace with logs on fire. Okay, so we have that, but we also have a wood burning fireplace in our home. And it's funny, like we do light the wood burning fireplace, and it's never like, you know, it's always better than the TV. But, you know, it's interesting, even that TV channel with the burning fire, I'm like, it actually does give off warmth, and it just has the crackle sounds and everything.
No, exactly.
Right?
No,
it's maybe not quite like the real thing, but it's pretty close.
No, exactly. It works because we did, my husband find out this, and I didn't know, and he put it on. I was like, I was a bit skeptical, I have to say, at the beginning, but then I went along and I was surprised that, as you said, it works. because we don't have a real fire, like a real cabinet, how do you say,
Fireplace. Yeah,
fireplace. We did
yeah.
have one in Italy, but we don't have it here.
Yeah.
But it still does work.
I'm so, there's so many small things we can do. And it comes back down to, even when I was just saying to you, if like you just look up, it's not just about looking up, but it's about looking somewhere else, because sometimes we get so in that dark downward spiral that's such a narrow focus space, because we're not looking in other places. And I think just that analogy of looking somewhere else, whether it's to a yoga retreat or to spending time with a friend, that's redirecting your focus, right? So looking somewhere else, I think is really good.
Yeah. And it's like breaking a cycle. It's like what I call taking a step back and taking perspective. So wherever you're in the middle of something and you're like really spiraling, or like you're feeling really stressed, taking a moment to stop. I always say, taking a moment to stop and take a breath. That breath is so powerful to like just rewire your whole system. Yeah. That like sometimes even like 5 breaths, that it literally takes like 2 minutes, 1 minute, can be a really game changer for what's coming next, in terms of how you feel, in terms of your behavior, because maybe you don't want to scream back at your boss or like send it like pissed email, or into the way you feel. And then like you're better suited to respond to whatever you have in front.
Yeah, exactly. One of the how every time I don't know, when I'm in a learning environment, I generally have like these really profound aha moments. They just shift how I view things. So when I was taking my diploma for positive psychology and well-being, I remember clearly when we were discussing the thoughts and the emotions that are happening in the mind. So how you were talking about the mind-body connection. And so going back to that mind piece, and that we were talking about how an emotion and a thought can basically create, like you have an emotion, it creates a thought, and that thought creates an emotion, and then emotion creates a thought. And it's like this repetitive circle inside your brain, inside your mind. And your body can actually interrupt those negative patterns, right? The negative circles, and it can cause something to just stop that emotion from creating that thought, and over and over and over again, right? Like, I'm not good enough and I'll never be able to do it. Oh, I can't apply for that job because I'm not good enough. And it feels, you're down on yourself, your self-worth is down. I mean, it's a perpetuating thing, right? So there must be I'm curious if yoga has, like, if its body postures are doing something like that. I don't know. I've never dug deep into yoga, and I'm curious if there's some body postures that are actually creating certain emotional experiences for people.
So I think it's a couple of elements. So I would think it's the attitude you approach the practice. So it can be a profound practice if you take that intention. Or it can be a mindless practice. So whenever I'm teaching, I try to cue people to be where they are, not to look around, not to get distracted, not to go on how to pilot. So basically, it's a full exercise of being present. Yeah. So not into your head, but into your body. So really embody where you are. Listen where your arm goes. Listen if your shoulders are lifting up or softening down. Listen how you feel with your chest. Listen how you feel with your feet grounding you down. And these are like practices that you can bring back when you're off the mat. Yeah. So what I always say, like, the practice on the mat is just the beginning. It's like, and it's why it's a practice. It's a never-ending journey, because it's like you're training yourself to develop that presence of the mind that you need whenever you're off the mat, whenever you're in a meeting and you feel anxious. Whenever you're like having a hard conversation with your partner, whenever you're having, I don't know, like whenever the political situation goes crazy and you live in the country. So it's more about like coming back to yourself. So it's also like redirecting your attention within and understanding moment by moment what you're going through. Yeah. Understanding where your attention goes. For example, you're on the mat, but maybe your mind goes like, oh, I need to cook the soup later on. Or maybe your mind goes like, oh, yesterday that person treated me really badly, and then you start ruminating again. So it's like understanding when this happens. And as we mentioned before, it's like breaking that cycle.
Yeah.
So the mind is amazing because like we all know the mind is able to shift around, like this beautiful term of like neuroplasticity. So we can choose which thoughts to develop, which thoughts to feed energy into that are supporting us, and which thought instead are like detrimental to us. Maybe they pull us down. Maybe they're not like really rewarding towards ourselves. So it's about understanding when that happens.
Mm-hmm.
So instead of maybe talking to yourself badly 10 times, maybe you do it 5. And then over time, maybe you go down to 1.
Mm-hmm.
So it's about also understanding that internal chatter a lot that you were mentioning about.
Yeah.
So most of the time we're so much into our head that like a lot of people, there's like a disconnection between mind and body because we're so busy like thinking and ruminating and like projecting, living the past. But like the body's like, thanks God, it attached the neck thing to the neck. But otherwise, like we're walking body, but like not on body.
Yeah.
So it's a lot about like.
Go ahead.
Go for it.
No, you go. We want to hear from you today. Let's go.
So it's a lot about connecting back. So there is a feedback going on. And especially when I talk about, for example, stress and burnout, so many people are like living so much into the head that they're not able to recognize the signals, or what I call like the whisperers that your body's sending you. So like you keep going and going and going until your body's like, hello, I'm done. And then it's like full knockout effect because like you cannot deal anymore with anything. And then you like fall into burnout or like something else. So it's a lot about like understanding and listening, because like sometimes you listen, but you don't want to listen. So you kind of turn your gaze away. And then the practice is like, okay, I want to invite myself to listen without judging. So that's also like a big part, like taking the judgment off, because like when you were saying about the loop, so much often that loop is about like judgment about myself, about how I behave, how I didn't behave, expectation, pressures, and all sorts of like these crazy elements. And we create such a big story into our mind that sometimes it's just overwhelming.
Yeah. So 2 things. When I have done a few yoga things, and I'm not like a regular yoga practice, but there's that sun salutation.
Yeah.
Okay. So that when I reflect on doing that posture or those postures together, I feel gratitude and calm, generally speaking. I would say that that's kind of an emotion that I feel if I were to focus on what emotion I'm feeling. And then the warrior pose, like when your arms are out and that one is like strength to me. Like I feel strong and vivacious, like sort of. So it's interesting to me that I'm curious if you can even bring that into when you're with people to say, this is your body and your mind working together. And there's an emotional piece, which is, what I call the heart. But, what's that? What's that other feedback loop? Like, and if you're intentional about noticing, does it make more of a difference?
Totally. And I think it's both. So basically, for a lot of people, it's like doing something that is kind of outside of your comfort zone. And I like to think that despite there is discomfort, sometimes this discomfort is like good. You need to play that out, so you don't want too much discomfort. Otherwise, your ability to cope with it, they're not there yet, and then you feel distressed. But when you put yourself in a situation where you're not in control, in a sense, because like you don't know what pose is coming up, you don't know how you're gonna feel, but then you learn to go with the flow. To trust your body and its signals. You strengthen your body as well, because it's not only strengthening like physically, but also mentally. Because sometimes you hold poses, they're not so easy. And then you need to stay there, keep your focus, keep your mindset, especially if you're doing like a balancing pose. If your mind goes to the soup, you're out of the pose. So it's also about like playing with your edges and also understand when it's good to push and when it's good to step back. So there is like this resting pose in yoga that is called balasana or child pose. That I always say to my student, I like to teach strong flow classes. And I like to challenge myself first in teaching them, and in my own practice, and also people like following. But it's always find that nice edge and balance between effort and surrender. So finding effort into the pose, but not in a way that you do harm to yourself.
Right.
So harm is a very profound principle into the practice. So you don't want to injure, you don't want to do bad to others, but you don't want to do bad to yourself. So you want to stay true to yourself, moving in a way that resonates with how you feel. So if in one day you feel tired, you don't go all the way to the strongest pose, because you listen to your body, you listen to those signals we were telling before, and then you know maybe that you take warrior two instead of a different pose.
Yeah.
And then at other times, you know that you have the strength, and it's playing in trusting your body that you can do it.
Yeah.
So sometimes, especially when I teach arm balances, for example, a lot of people have fear, because like you're balancing on your hands, you're leaning forward, the floor looks very close to you. And it's like embracing that point where you're like playing with it. You're like embracing that fear, but you're trusting your body that you know how to do it. You're not throwing yourself in, because otherwise you're going to face plant. We're like playing with like seeing how it feels. Can I go? Can I not go?
Yeah.
And also like trusting that you can explore.
Yeah.
And it's a playful practice. So I can be very serious, but it can also be very playful when you do it. So serious in the sense that like you want to focus inwards. You want to focus on yourself. You don't want to look around like what your neighbor is doing. It's about yourself. It's not about like, it's not even about comparing yourself to others. It's like an inner practice. You do in a group. Sometimes you do it alone, but it's an inner practice.
Yeah. So I'm noticing this connection between, okay, the effort and surrender, this balance. I just love that notion, and the burnout that happens in the workplace. Because I think one of the things you mentioned earlier is that we want to, or I don't know if you mentioned the word, but what I hear often is that we just want to keep pushing, like, and we need to be resilient. So we're going to keep pushing, and resilience isn't about pushing. It's actually about recharging more than, not always pushing. And so can you share with me a little bit about your perspective of how that effort and surrender concept on the mat, what does it translate to off the mat in the workplace?
Yeah, you really touch a really interesting point. And I think that I've done a couple of talks on rest, and these are the talks that got like, they resonated the most with people. So I think that we live in a society that is really pushing us to do more, to achieve the next thing. And rest is always thought like, okay, I can rest when and if I have time. But we're missing out the whole kind of deal of it, because like, whenever I talk about rest, it's about like your energy. It's about like replenishing all the energy that you're like spending and losing when working, when like having conversation with people, like we're dealing with your daily life. Yeah. So like the thing is that resilience is a beautiful term, as you mentioned, but it's not always about like pulling and pulling and pulling, because if you keep pulling the elastic, sooner or later it's gonna snap on your face. Yeah. And I think that I have a sports background. I used to swim competition. And I think that the idea of rest is really good in the sports community. So like if we look at athletes can train their body really hard. Maybe like they spend hours per day training, but then they rest. And that's the only way they can grow stronger. So you can stress your body, and it's kind of the same on the yoga practice. Like you stress your body to be stronger. You stress yourself with like challenging tasks at work, but then you need to take time to recover, because we know our body and our mind are not built to keep going. They're not built to always be into activation mode or like engaging mode with like people, society, technology, work. So that part is missing. So we're missing that piece where we need to like recharge, when we need to kind of like stop, evaluate. Is this doing me well? So I think that COVID, as we were saying before, has been a little bit of that. So a lot of people are like, wait a moment, is this workplace good for myself? Is this workplace or this job, or is the rhythm I'm having working, serving me well or not?
Yeah.
So it was like a big shock. And whenever there is a shock, everybody gets like a little bit like shocked. So you start looking at things in a slightly different way.
Yeah.
So we want to take time to rest. I'm a very active person. And the first time I gave this talk about rest, my friend was like, that's a funny one, Paola, because you're always so active. And I was like, yes, you're right. But because I'm always so active, I'm learning more and more that to be in that state, I need to rest. And I start to learn the signals that my body's sending me when I'm in need of rest.
Would you mind actually sharing? I was just going to ask, like, can you share something a bit more on the personal side? Like, what does your body say? And what do you do to incorporate rest?
Yeah. So for me, I used to have panic attacks when I was in high school. And I'm generally on the anxious side. And I noticed that if I'm working too much, or there is a little bit of like too much stress into my life, not like the kind of good stress that it is enhancing, but this kind of stress is just too much, I don't start sleeping well. But for me, is that my anxiety starts bubbling up. Okay. So for me, I start to notice over the time that I was like, it's interesting that this is happening. Or I start self-doubting myself. So that's the moment that I start to get like, did I do it right? Did I do it right? And I start ruminating a lot. So these are the signals. And of course, my body feels just tired. Not the kind of tiredness that like maybe I did a workout and I feel tired, but that tiredness that is a little bit more prolonged. Yeah. So even if like I eat healthy, I try to sleep the hours that I need, my body's still a little bit like low of energy. But especially for me, the mind is the main element for myself. And also another one is that I start to get edgy. So I start to get like kind of easy to trigger, kind of irritable, like things that usually I don't care or they don't bother me. Immediately it's like an explosion, like start like kind of screaming around or like not able to deal with it. So these are the signals. I'm like, okay, Paola, it's clear, you need to rest. And for me, rest can be spending time in nature. So since I moved here, I really noticed that nature is like, for me, is really important. And it can be taking a walk at the park, going in nature for a weekend. And also for me, resting is doing something that refuel myself. I love cooking. I'm Italian. So sometimes I cook more. So I start cooking something that takes a little bit longer. So it takes like preparation. And especially if I bake, that's the best. Like also the activity of like doing something with my hands, it's really great. So I was reading research that I was amazed at doing that calms me down. And I was like, there must be a reason. And the reason is doing something manually brings you in the body as well. So every time you work like with your body, brings that energy down into the body again. Through COVID, I started coloring mandala. So I was coloring it. That was really helpful, but it's also reading. So I love reading, and that I notice that if I'm not inspired, I cannot inspire others. And being like a source of inspiration is my intention whenever I have the chance to talk to people or also on the mat. So I notice that this is important for me. So I need to carve out time into my days to really take time to read, listening to podcasts. I'm really like, I love listening to podcasts and I love being curious and staying with people. So I notice that, for example, whenever I'm really, really busy, I don't nurture my connection that much. And that's a moment when I start to isolate myself. And that's also a signal, for example, that I need to rest. I need to slow down a bit.
Yeah. And I love that because I think sometimes people hear the term rest and they think, oh, I'm just supposed to be on the couch all day in my pajamas. But that's not intentional rest. It's not nourishing your body and your mind, right? So I just love what you share. And so, oh my gosh.
Well, and when
go ahead.
Sorry.
No, go ahead.
One more thing. When it comes to rest, there's so many different type of rest we need. So for example, I already touched base in some, like we need rest from digital device, and it's a big one, especially because we're so like surrounded by technology. We need rest sometimes from people, but rest also is like being with people that nurture you, being with people that like brings you the best out of you, that like you share idea, you get like that uplift energy when you spend time with them. It's about like moving the body or not moving the body, but it's also being intentional. For me, rest is like going for a walk, or for me, like going for a run. It doesn't suit everybody, but it's like active physical rest. It's like I get into the zone and like I kind of get into flow. So when I do sports, I sometimes get into that state of being in a flow, and that's just amazing for the body and for the mind, because it's really like re-energizing.
Yeah, I just love it. I want to do more on the mat work to help transfer some on the mat skills to the off the mat skills. Just I love that analogy, and I really want to thank you for just sharing you with our crew today, with our listeners, and I look forward to staying connected with you. How is your energy now after connecting with me, even though it's online and Zoom?
Really nice.
Yeah.
That's why I love connecting with people like passionate with the same, like in the same field, sharing ideas, bouncing ideas, always getting inspired, because I think that that's the same. To give energy to people or to inspire people, you need to like fill your cup first. So there is this saying, like, you cannot pour from an empty cup.
Yeah.
So for me, it's like almost 9 in that, like that time.
I know, right? Yeah.
So it's kind of late, but I feel really good. And it has been a really busy week.
Yeah.
But I feel really energized from this conversation.
Yeah. Well, I really looked forward to this conversation, and that's another interesting thing. But this show is rest for me then, technically, because it is connection, and it's always about topics that really fill our cups. And so thank you for filling my cup. I'm glad yours is filled as well.
Same, exactly. It was both. Usually the funny thing is that's both ways. Yeah. So one more like thing I want to share with you. I was reading about kindness. And I think it's about kindness is it helps both the giver and the receiver. So it's always like both ways, because like we're a human creature, we're like social bonding. So whenever something is happening, it's always like coming from both sides. So it was very energizing and refilling my cup as well.
It's a double lollipop. There's something sweet on both ends. That's what I say about kindness.
Exactly. I like that.
Yeah, awesome. Grazie tanto, è stato un gran piacere di incontrarti.
My pleasure as well. Grazie.